Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the New Columbia Movement YouTube channel. Thank you all for tuning in, wherever you're tuning in from. I am Sean. I'm the head of the Southeast chapter, and tonight I'm excited to be joined by Adam from the Northeast chapter, who has sat down with us before on a roundtable to do a little pre-election discussion on an article that was written by Ray Dalio back in June of this year that has some interesting implications about where we're headed as a nation, what's coming, and we are quite literally here on the eve, on the precipice of this next election, what he believes is going to be the most important election in his lifetime. The gentleman has been around for a long time, a lot longer than we have. So we decided it would be important to sit down, talk a little bit about it, and kind of explore some ideas and concepts going forward about what the future of this country looks like and what our role to play in all that is, without making any crazy and bombastic predictions ourselves. But we might even dabble in that. We'll see. So Adam, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
We always have our vices. So what do you got tonight?
Tonight I am finishing up a Troegs Double Bock Troegenator, proudly brewed in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So it's a good beer.
Very
Especially
nice.
for this cooling off time of the year, which is I don't know about you guys, but it was well in the upper 70s today. So it doesn't quite feel like the 1st of November, but here we are anyway.
No, I am in Georgia, and it was in the mid 70s today. So it is quite a nice ease into the winter season here. For my vice tonight, I am smoking a Macanudo. I think this is their cafe. Yeah, it is the Macanudo Cafe. So it's a nice light cigar. I think it's a good golf course cigar for anybody who likes to go golfing. I like my lighter cigars. I feel like if I get something too dark, it's a little rough for me, but I will dabble in those every now and again too. But I don't want to be distracted by coughing fit while I'm trying to explore some concepts and ideas. So anyway, so thank you for being here tonight, Adam. Just the two of us tonight, but we both read this book, The Changing World Order, which you see here on the screen, by Ray Dalio. And the article that he wrote back in June, which was titled, what was the title of it now? I can't even remember. Something along the lines of,
pick a side and fight for it, keep your head down or flee, which is basically the options that Mr. Dalio thinks the average U.S. citizen is going to have here in a very turbulent next few years and beyond.
Yeah, I think it's a good article for you all to sit down and read. And if you're interested in reading the book, by all means do that too. You can get the audio book. That's what I did, actually. I'm an audiobook guy, so I listened to that for free on Spotify, I think. But there's a lot of interesting concepts. If you're not familiar with Ray Dalio, he's kind of a billionaire investor, hedge fund manager, and he is big into psychoanalysis and kind of predicting the next wave from a financial standpoint to make investments and do these types of things. And so I think that in these situations, when you have people making these evaluations, it's easy to kind of separate ourselves and try to look at it from a 1,000-foot view and forget that we are also here in the midst of it as well, right? Where this is not an analyzation of history and something that has happened. We're not looking way out into the future at something that will happen. We're really kind of talking about a cultural phenomenon, financial phenomenon that we're going to be living through most likely. And so I think that puts it into perspective a little bit more and makes it all the more worthwhile to dive into and really try to dissect and understand. I don't think that Ray Dalio is necessarily our guy. By that, I mean, he's a moderate left-leaning guy is my perception of him. I don't know if you know much about him in that regard, but based on the way he kind of illustrates concepts, though I will say that I think, again, from his 1,000-foot perspective view, he was somewhat fair in analyzing both the left and the right in this kind of coming clash that he sees and that he was drawing out.
Yeah, he definitely seems to be a relatively apolitical figure, at least in a sort of dogmatic perspective, but somebody whose number one goal, of course, is to make money for himself and his clients as a hedge fund manager. One of the interesting things he does say in this article that sort of supports him being sort of a more left-leaning guy is he's been operating under the assumption that Trump supporters are the more extreme currently in the left-right spectrum in American politics right now, but that he's changing his mind on that. So The article, of course, that we'll be quoting from is a little bit more recent than the book that it draws the information from, and we can see sort of how he's changed some of his opinions between 2020, when the Changing World Order was published, and the more recent article from this year. So things, he is evolving, but of course he's definitely not anybody we would consider as a right-wing pundit for sure, but somebody who is looking at the situation more holistically, sort of as an outsider with not political objectives, but objectives in business and finance.
I want to read the introduction here real quick, and this is going to allude to his book, The Changing World Order. But the introduction goes, as you know, based on my study of history, I believe there are now and have always been 5 big interrelated forces that drive how domestic and world orders change. There are, number 1, the big debt, credit, money cycle. Number 2, the big internal order disorder cycle. Number 3, the big external order disorder cycle. Number 4, acts of nature, i.e. droughts, floods, pandemics, etc. And number 5, human innovation that leads to advances in technology. Today, I am focusing on why I believe we are approaching the point in the internal order disorder cycle when you will have to choose between picking a side, fighting for it, keeping your head down, or fleeing. So like you were saying, and his whole precipice is, he is analyzing this from the perspective of an investor, but he, I think, is also understanding that this is something that's going to affect real world people. And so he's saying, look, we're reaching a point where you're going to have to pick a side and fight for it, or you're going to have to just go along to get along, or you're going to have to get the heck out. And this will make more sense as we get more into the article. But he goes on to say, I believe we now have to face the fact that fighting for democracy as we know it, with thoughtful disagreement and compromise governed by rule of law, is unlikely to work. People like me who had a long shot hope for the emergence of a strong middle that fights against the extremists to bring the country together and makes major reforms to improve the system must recognize that the differences are becoming too irreconcilable for this to happen. I think that I highlighted that strong middle word because I think that is such a laughable illusion from my perspective, in that you will, and I don't mean this to be insulting, but the idea of the strong middle is kind of self-interested people who naturally are already keeping their heads down, as if these are people who are dogmatically going to beat their chests against going towards one extreme or the other. And that's just not, that just seems to be a lack of logical flow there, and estimating that that's something that would ever happen, given that he can obviously see the trends. And maybe this is just him coming to that realization and he's kind of fleshing that out. But there's no historical example of a strong middle that fights for consistency when you have such compounding problems where there are 2 extremes fighting against each other.
It's something I think we could sort of see in real time as fading away, especially with the recent sort of transitions from both Tulsi Gabbard, who was somebody who sort of represented that strong middle, throw her hat into the ring with Trump, because there's simply no compromising with the left. The left, of course, are the ones who pretend to be that strong middle, and also with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a leftist icon. I mean, some of his, especially his environmental perspectives, are way out in left field, and yet here he is, as again, this icon of what was a strong. Now he looks like a strong middle of the road guy, where in just a few years ago, you would have pegged this man on the far left. And so I guess you could see it 2 ways. Number one, is this strong middle now just rising up and sort of walking away from the left, or is it falling apart completely and everybody is now picking a side? Because I sure don't think that Robert F. Kennedy, he's not dropping those old beliefs, right? And completely, you wouldn't call him a conservative still, but he's almost like the last honest liberal who is still holding true to those values that the center left had for many, many, many years. And now the left has completely abandoned him. And what center left today is not what was center left back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Of course, when he was first getting into politics, and of course the politics that we know from his father and uncle in the 60s, and their thought leadership of what was then the center left. So I guess you could see it as either way, but regardless of what's happening, is these center folks are now picking a side, and it's very obvious to see that there's not a lot of room for compromise for a lot of these guys on the left, because as soon as those ideas, any sort of clash is not accepted, right? And what classifies as the right now is a little bit more willing to concede on some of those points and be sort of that big tent party that the Republicans have always pretended to be. Now, for better or for worse, whether they like it or not, they've become that big tent just because one side is so dogmatic in their views.
I think that's why strong middle is a fallacy, because he's suggesting that there has been some kind of, stable, reasonable, middle of the road people who have always been kind of protecting society from the extremes. And I think that that's a miscalculation to assume that that's kind of the way the world has worked. I think you have either a society of continuity or you have a society of disunion. And now a society of continuity, you can have two different societies that are both, have continuity, but are radically opposed to one another, right? You can have a radically left society and you can have a radically right society, if you want to put it in those terms, and they can have continuity, but there isn't necessarily a strong middle in either one of those societies, And I think that that's what we're looking at, is that we had at one point, the United States was a high trust society, and it had a continuity in the American idea, which, for better or for worse, there were always political differences in this country, but the margins of disagreement between the left and the right were much smaller than they are now. And this is kind of the nature of progressivism and the way it's taken us, not just in this country, but globally. But, the end stages of left liberalism is it's gotten so far to the left that now the margins between what the left and the right believe are so extreme. So there is, your conservatives, right, which is the idea that we want to conserve that which we hold valuable and sacred, our nation, our families, our communities, our faith, all those types of things. Then you have the progressives who feel threatened by conservation because they believe that society has to kind of always move forward. And that's why they see these conservative actions and these conservative figures so threatening, because it's not just putting the brakes on progression, but it's deconstructing their entire worldview that we can only march forward. And history doesn't necessarily show that. Right. There's plenty of ebbs and flows in history, which is kind of what we're talking about today. So he says, when I wrote the book in 2020, okay, so I misspoke earlier. 2020 was when he wrote and published the book, not 2019. I saw the writing on the wall, but had hoped for the possibility that we would not cross the brink into a type of civil war. So I estimated the chances of that as about 1 in 3. Now I think the risk of some form of civil war is uncomfortably more than 50%. I am confident in the next year we will know the answer to whether we will cross the brink. So he wrote the book back in 2020. He put about a third of a chance that we were going to go into a civil war. And as he goes on, he'll explain that a civil war doesn't necessarily have to be violent. But he believes that there is going to be some kind of political uprising, revolution in this country because of a number of compounding factors that we'll get into. But what was when you read the book, what was your overall perspective? Stage 2 is the big internal disorder cycle. So that's what this article is mostly focusing on. And I will, by the way, I will put the link to the article in the description below for those of you who want to watch it. I will also put a link to the book for anybody that wants to read it. But what was your overall thoughts on his kind of how he laid things out in the book?
His disorder cycle is a pretty convincing case. He lays it out mathematically with charts and everything that show the rise and fall of all of the empires and the sort of history driving nations of the last 500 years, going back to the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, British Empire, the United States now, and up and coming what he believes is going to be China as the next major hegemon, following the United States' slow decline, which we're now experiencing. So it's a little bit more of a mathematical analysis of the hard times create strong men cycle, which of course is just a simplified version of the life cycle of empires. It's something that's it's a very basic analysis. he does back it up with math, but it works, right? It does provide somebody who's not a student of history with a easy illustration of sort of how these things happen. And he does make the good case that generally it's financial problems that are going to lead to an empire's collapse, whether that collapse happens from within or whether it makes that empire weak enough to then be taken over by a stronger rival through military force. So he lists examples of all of those, but he does make the very convincing case that financial problems are usually where these things start, usually happens with debt. And we're facing it right now, right? Is the only thing the United States has had going for it that the other nations haven't is that our currency has remained the world's reserve currency for a longer period, and that there's nothing else to really overtake it at this point. So we'll see what happens. I mean, people are starting to move away from the dollar, but at least
even that has life cycles, right? I mean, and I think this is something that he talked about in the book, and he touched on it, is the life cycles of dominant currencies, and it usually follows, some country coming out on top on some major war or something like that. He talked about the Dutch and the British, and then the Spanish, the French, kind of all of these empires of the in their own sphere, kind of sharing global hegemony at one point or another. And so there are life cycles to these things too. And many in the financial world estimate the United States to be at the end of its life cycle as the world reserve currency. And so that's a good point. And I think that all of these political ramifications, all of these cultural tensions, it's all there, right? It's all under the surface. And the thing that really opens the floodgates for that kinetic action to solve problems, to war is an extension of politics effectively, right? Is the financial situation gets so dire, so difficult, so drastic that when you're weighing your options and you're looking at the consequences of actions, you're saying, you know what, things are so bad right now that it's better for me to risk my life out in the battlefield for a better chance of the future rather than continue to suffer under this current regime or system or whatever it is. And I think that's what we're looking at. We have the polarization that already exists. It's been building for the past several decades. You and I have both grown up in a world of increasing polarization, but even I can still remember back to my youth where politics was not it didn't seem to be the subject of everything that was going on. Politics and culture, and of course there's a lot of crossover. So I think that's important to understand, is that we're one bad financial collapse away from really seeing things get bad. And we'll get into this a little bit later because I have some stuff in the presentation that I want to share, but we are in a financial pickle, to put it lightly. And I don't want to be a pessimist, but at a certain point, how does a country $35 trillion in debt dig its way out of that hole when the system is already set up to not allow that? So
just so everyone is on the same page, I do just want to read a brief of what his internal cycle is. It's 6 stages, but this will sort of help provide context for what we're talking about. So stage 1 is when the new order begins and a new leadership consolidates power. So this is when the upstart power has knocked the old power off the throne. Again, whether that's because the old power collapsed internally and there's a new one ready to take the reins, or the upstart power has now conquered and defeated militarily the old power. Stage 2 is when the resource allocation systems and government bureaucracies are built and refined. So this is the up and coming power has now consolidated that power. You have competent leaders who are creating the bureaucracy, creating the legal systems that are going to drive that nation forward. Stage 3 is when there's peace and prosperity. These stages have now been, or these systems have now been put in place. Commerce is flourishing. We now have sort of the peace and the trade, and things are looking up for this nation. Stage 4 is when the excesses in spending and debt and the widening begins of wealth and political gaps. So at this point, you now have the nation taking on more debt. Its expansion is now debt financed. Its legal or bureaucracy is now debt financed, and purchases are now of its citizenry are now largely debt financed. So the basically access to credit is what's going to determine a person's wealth. And you're going to start seeing those gaps happen where an elite in commerce has risen, and then there's the lower classes that are expanding. The wealth gap between the two is going more and more. Stage 5 is when there are bad financial conditions and intense conflict. That conflict can be internal, it can be external, but more importantly, the nation has now borrowed more than it can ever hope to pay back. And this is basically where it's the make or break. He says, really, this stage can go on. You can prolong the death of an empire basically indefinitely, as long as you're still able to control those credit conditions. But once the internal conflict has started, you've really passed the point of no return with that. So stage 5 is the make or break stage, which is now where Ray Dalio believes the United States has entered. Stage 6 is when the violence has actually started. There are civil wars, revolutions, or a rival power has now begun its conquest of the old and failing power. So after stage 6, of course, stage 1 begins again with the rival now having taken the mantle of the hegemon, for whether that's the military or financial hegemony of establishing itself. So those are the 6 credits. Those are the 6 pieces. Stage 5, of course, is the worst one because you can get out of it, but it's not easy. And I can't think of, I think he even says nobody's done it yet. Theoretically, it's possible. Different empires have prolonged it, but going from stage 5 back to stage 4 or even 3, it's not likely, and it takes a lot of sacrifice on behalf of the people that really nobody wants to do. So that's sort of where we are.
Well, it's a fundamental concept that there has to become some kind of stress test or some kind of hurdle, some mountain to climb to get to the next, valley, right? And I think this is what's understood. And the argument and the point that he makes is, there is some kind of conflict. These cycles are ubiquitous across time. It's like the idea, like you're talking about, of breaking out of these cycles is silly. It's just the way human nature develops. This was also explored by Strauss and Howe in the Fourth Turning book, where they talk about generational cycles, which goes all the way back to like the Etruscans, where the Etruscans talk about these 90-year generational cycles, and how you have these conflict cycles that kind of mark big periods in history. And so Strauss and Howe were using that to determine, and they wrote their book back in the late 90s, and they were determining that the 2020s was going to be another one of those big break cycles for the United States and the world as a whole, kind of coming off the heels of the last big one, which was, as in their opinion, World War II. And there's so many other things, right, that all point towards this kind of era in human history, particularly in the United States, as being one of these big inflection points for something happening, something transformational happening. Now, the point that Ray Dalio makes is you can have these big transformational things without there being violence, but you can, and this is what's important to know, is you can also have them with violence, and it can be very, very bad violence. You can look at the 1917 revolution of the Russians. You can look at the French Revolution, which doesn't get talked about enough for how bad it was for the average person, and you can also have these kind of, what he was talking about, either an external or internal threat. You can have those at the same time. There are plenty of examples of nations fighting internal strifes and civil wars while at the same time facing an external enemy, which it seems like the United States is apt to do, given its presence in the world right now. I mean, we are top dog, and when you're top dog and you're starting to falter, there's plenty of others who are kind of chomping at the bit to take your place, right? And he does get into it in the book a lot. He talks about China a lot, and he perceives China to be the next one up to bat. You and I are both skeptical on that for reasons that we'll get into, but he says in the article, and he says in the book, he says there are now big irreconcilable differences producing win at all cost perspectives that is undermining willingness to accept the judgments of the legal system. So that's huge, especially when it comes to having a high trust society. It doesn't matter what governmental structure you have, whether it's monarchy or anarchy is not real, but whether it's monarchy or democracy or whatever, anything in between, high trust society, faith in the legal system is necessary for any society to function. And that is being eroded on a daily basis. And so what we have is these two extremes that it is producing these win at all costs. Because think about it from the perspective of a Trump supporter going into the election, right? Myself, you, hopefully, going into this election, we are looking at the left and we are saying, okay, we remember the summer of love and the total carte blanche that criminals and violent rioters were given in this country to express their, whatever it was considered, their First Amendment right by robbing Nike stores and burning down car lots, right? We say that is unacceptable. We are not willing to tolerate that in society. We're not willing to be victimized by that. We see an endless stream of illegal immigrants coming over the border who are now being given the opportunity to vote in elections. So it is a win at all costs. If we don't win this election, we are looking at never winning another election again, because we can have a what do they call it? An amnesty period where they basically legalize all illegals here, and now you have a whole new voting base that's added, which, by the way, are strategically being placed in all of these swing states to effectively create a one-party state for all elections going forward. So there's the perspective from the right as far as why this election needs to be won, on top of all the other, really important things. I think that's the main thing at the top of everybody's mind right now from the right. But obviously, economic decisions and policies. And, as much as I love Trump and I think he has the right idea about economics, I think there is an unavoidable collapse or transformation period, to put it a little more lightly, that we have to go through as a country in order to get back, to a healthy economy again. And now from the perspective of the left, and I was listening to a video by Academic Agent today, and I was just alluding to this, a progressive's idea of a conservative is fundamentally threatening to their worldview because of this idea that we must continue to march on, that we are at the end of history, right? That all things were leading to this, that all ideas from the past were only, getting us to the point where we can understand that gender isn't actually real. That we're all, that nations and borders and ideas and family and all of these things are so antiquated because we're so progressive. And so pushing back on that fundamentally destroys their worldview. And so somebody like Trump getting into power is, this is why they displayed Handmaid's Tale as what the Trump presidency would look like, because this is the way they're conceptualizing it in their brain. Trump becomes president and women are deduced now to simply being there as instruments of birth to bring about the next generation of men or something like that, right? And so I think it's important to provide maybe I'm not very good at getting in the head of a leftist, but I think it is important to provide context as to why both sides will see this coming election as kind of the end-all be-all for elections. And further, for the leftist point, I think that they also genuinely believe that Trump and a Trump presidency is going to weaponize institutions and using things like the Supreme Court to politically target leftists, which is a major case of projection, obviously, but there is that threat too, that they feel like, and this is why I think the people on the right are always referred to as Nazis and fascists, because they fear the strong man, and they fear this perceived idea of democracy that they have in their heads as being completely threatened by somebody who can come in and kind of turn the tables over on that completely. And so I think that's another good reason to look at why they think this is a win at all cost election.
Yeah, I mean, I used to kind of dismiss the whole, Trump's a Nazi thing, because they've called basically every single conservative and Republican figurehead going back to like Reagan Nazis. But the further we go on, the more I see that they actually like believe this, which to them will justify the lengths that they are willing to go to prevent a Trump presidency. Right, they will be willing to abandon whatever principles they say they have as far as democracy, as far as election integrity, and even as far as political violence, because they genuinely believe they are stopping the next Hitler from coming to power. They are a lot more wound up, I think, than a lot of people on the right realize, that they're not just saying it this time. Like, they actually believe this. And most of us will think, well, that's just absurd, but this is a core belief that they have now, and I don't think that can be underestimated when looking at their motives and looking at what they will be willing to do to keep and retain power because they genuinely believe they are stopping the next incarnation of Hitler.
So in this article, Ray Dalio goes on to talk about what he sees coming. And one thing I highlighted here was he said a clash between state governments and fractured central governments appear likely, which I would regard as a type of civil war, even if not violent. So I find this interesting because, again, he wrote this year in June of 2024. And, he's saying, well, this is something that might be coming. I'm saying, I think this is something that's already happening. And I wanted to insert this clip here real quick of a video to kind of illustrate that
billionaire investors,
excuse me, not that one, that this is something that's happening.
A showdown at the U.S. southern border between local authorities in Texas and the federal government over how to handle the influx of migrants.
We're here under the governor's order in order to protect Texas.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott continuing what's known as Operation Lone Star, a nearly 3-year-old initiative to deter migrants from illegally crossing into the U.S. From adding extra troopers like Sergeant Cordova at the border, placing floating barriers in the river, passing laws that allow state and local law enforcement to arrest migrants who entered Texas illegally, and the latest, installing razor wire along the banks of the Rio Grande. Despite these obstacles, migrants like this man still trying to cross. He says he just wants to surrender and ask for asylum. On Monday, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled federal Border Patrol agents could take down the razor wiring. The decision further fueling the divide between Texas and the federal government over who has the authority to secure the border. The Department of Homeland Security saying rather than helping to reduce irregular migration, the state of Texas has only made it harder for frontline personnel to do their jobs and to apply consequences under the law. Meanwhile, migrant crossings continue.
We're getting high crossings from different parts of the world.
Just this past Monday, a law enforcement source familiar with the operations on the ground said Border Patrol agents apprehended about 4,000 migrants. In mid-December, those daily numbers were closer to 10,000. I'm Jen Sullivan reporting.
And here's another example. California governor signs law to ban voter ID to ban local voter ID requirements. So two perfect examples right there. You have federal law that already requires that you must be a U.S. citizen to vote in federal elections. You have Governor Newsom going out of his way to ignore that and make it legal in the state of California to vote as a non-citizen, because you can't even ask for voter ID. You can't even ask if they're a citizen in this coming election. Furthermore, like with that video we just watched, you have had examples already of a clash between federal forces and state forces. The state Governor Abbott was sending the National Guard down to the border to enforce our laws, which is that you have to enter this country legally, and you had a federal agency, the Border Patrol, which again, I'm not faulting the Border Patrol agent per se, but you had a federal agency that was undermining a state's attempt at enforcing federal law, right? So you already see the buildup towards this kind of inevitable clash. And I think even furthermore, most recently with Hurricane Helene, you had a somewhat of a clash between, this was more so between, organized volunteer forces and the federal responses from like FEMA and stuff like that, or the lack thereof. So I think there's been plenty of examples within just the last couple of years alone to show this kind of tit for tat escalation between conservative, right-centric state powers and authorities and even local organizations, and your institutional left federal bureaucracy. And I think that this is something that we certainly see a continuation of going forward.
Even just this week with what happened in Virginia, where Virginia discovered, I think it was about 16,000 non-citizens on their voter rolls, and they were like, absolutely sure, yeah, these are not eligible voters.
Mm-hmm.
The lower courts basically said, no, you need to keep those people on your voter rolls, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, who was finally able to, I don't know if the Supreme Court is allowing them to take all of them off the voter rolls, or at least some of them, but this had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. But the lower federal courts were going to try and force Virginia to keep known ineligible voters on the voter rolls for this election. And that's, I mean, that's absolute insanity. And even the moderates in charge of Virginia would tell you that that was insanity. But here you go, the federal government trying to force the state to not even follow its own laws.
Right.
This was a law on the book in Virginia, and the federal government was saying, no, you can't enforce your own decade plus old law on who is eligible to vote or not.
Sure. Yeah. And I you know, and I'm appreciative of Governor Youngkin and what he's trying to do there, because he is mandating paper ballots. And I think you see, again, even more to the point, you see governors in red states across the country who are taking precautions going into this election to ensure legitimacy. So Governor Youngkin, my governor from Virginia, is taking precautions by doing what you just talked about there, also mandating paper ballots, you know, because there is a genuine concern that the election is going to be stolen, obviously. So yeah, so you have all of these problems, you have all these precedents that have already been set to say that there is a soft civil war or a cold civil war, right? I don't think that's controversial to say, just because of how polarized and how divided this country is. It's very obvious, and you're seeing a continuation of migration within the country to regions and states that are more aligned with their political values. And so you see, and I think this is one of the things that they were talking about in a video the other day, where I was kind of watching some pre-election analysis of, you know, what states and what counties are going where. And you're seeing like some of these places that were turning red in previous elections are getting more and more red, and vice versa. You're seeing the same thing with these blue areas are getting more and more blue. And so you're seeing kind of a compounding effect of all of these different places that are really entrenching in their ideological beliefs. So I wanted to point out those examples. Now, the other thing that Ray talks about, and this is a big one, we alluded to this already, but I want to get into the meat and potatoes of this a little bit more, is that stage 5, when there are bad financial conditions and intense conflict. So he says that there's a classic toxic mix of forces that brings about big internal conflicts consisting of 1, the country and the people in the country or state or city being in bad financial shape. 2, large income, wealth, and value gaps within that entity. And 3, severe negative economic shock. So I think the only thing that we haven't seen of those 3 yet is the severe negative economic shock. And I think that is the linchpin that could precipitate what we are concerned about here, which is some kind of civil war type scenario going forward.
As far as a financial shock goes, I mean, I have to believe it's only a matter of time. This is something I've seen coming. That I thought was going to happen around 2022, and I hedged my own financial bets on that happening, and turned out to be wrong. But we have printed within the last 4 years, I think 2/3 of every dollar that's come into existence. We're about $37 trillion in debt, and climbing now at an exponential rate. This can't continue, but we're also past the point of no return where there's no real fixing it, right? It would take, if the federal government spent like no money based on its revenue, it would take like it would take like 6 or 7 years for the federal government to pay off the debt if it spent no money, zero, and it kept tax rates the exact same. But it's coming at any time. And the spending has kept it at bay, but we're going to see a recession of 2008 caliber or worse, and it seems to be right around the corner, right? Property prices are at an all-time high. Anybody who's come of age since the start of COVID-19 is basically locked out of home ownership, and therefore locked out of starting a family. You're having an entire generation of young people for whom the American dream is a total pipe. It's just not going to happen for them. On top of that, the millennials have been told for years that there's going to be a great wealth transfer once the boomer generation passes on. But recent studies are now showing that wealth transfer is going to be much smaller than expected, right? The millennials' last hope of being able to inherit, a sizable sum to try and catch up to where their parents were at their age is not going to happen for most of them now. That money is going to be spent on the boomer generation living longer, on medical expenses. It's not going to be passed down. So at some point, and it has to happen necessarily within the next few years, there's going to be a correction. We cannot keep on this pace forever. I'm genuinely surprised it hasn't happened yet. But locally, I mean, I see the signs of a really bad economy. We're losing restaurants in my area at a pretty rapid pace now, right? I go into any of the local gun stores that we have, and they're overflowing with used inventory that they can't sell. People coming to trade in firearms that they're not moving because nobody has any money to buy them. And in an election year, a really pivotal election year, that's unheard of, right? You should see basically all the gun stores locally sold out of anything halfway decent. But here it all is sitting on the shelves. But yet at the same time, I have a very good friend of mine who works for Toyota. They can't keep cars on the lot, and their average sale is an all-cash purchase. So you're seeing this massive gap between, I don't know if it's the older generations, I don't know if it's foreign investors but there's people with enough money to keep the system chugging along, but yet every year we're minting more and more young adults who are never going to have a chance at this unless something radical changes. And if the new projections are correct, and that money is not going to trickle down to the younger generations, collapse is inevitable. It's only a matter of when. So
not even mentioning Social Security, by the way.
Not even mentioning Social Security. I mean, I just met with my own financial advisor this week, and I told him, don't even put it in the projections you're going to give me. And right. He said that's probably a good thing. So it's and that's
write that off.
Yeah, we're pretending it doesn't even exist because it's not going to.
Write off all my cash savings too.
Yeah. So it's not good, right? Anybody under 30 is not, except for a few exceptions, is not going to have the same lifestyle as their parents. Another anecdote, at least locally, from our church co-op with the other young parents, everybody else who's involved in this generally is, you have one working parent and a spouse staying home. All of them except for us are doctors, right? So it now takes a doctor level income to keep one spouse staying home to take care of a family with multiple children. And these families are not they're not living high off the hog, right? They don't have massive houses. They're driving used cars, sometimes even older cars than my wife and I have. But what it takes now for a parent to stay home is you got to have a doctor level income. Maybe you have, a husband working the trades, but he's busting his butt 60, 70 hours a week, banking all the overtime. And that could be pulled away at any moment if things go south. But my dad was able to keep my mom home at a mid-level engineer salary. So you could do this just a few years ago, back in the 90s, on the average income. And we lacked for nothing. I had a very great childhood, but I can't give my kids the same. It just won't happen. Both my wife and I have to work. Come early next year, each of us is going to have 2 jobs just to keep the money coming in and the food on the table. It will not continue. It's obvious why people are no longer having kids, which will lead us to another topic on a couple things we think he gets wrong. But birth rates are at an all-time low and falling. It's not going to change unless the entire system changes.
I love that you're hitting on all these things that I had slides prepared for. That's hilarious. But yeah, so we're in the same mindset right now. Yeah. So these, by the way, for those watching, these slides that I'm flipping through, I'm taking screenshots from a website called WTF Happened in 1971. If you haven't been to that website, go ahead and give that a good doom scroll because it's eye-opening. And this is something that I talk about a lot, but you were talking about this. So in 1971, let's just go back where it starts, say 1970. You had 38% of households, you only had the husband working, and you had 47% of households where you had both spouses working. Today, it's 21% versus 66%. So, right, that's remarkable. I took this screenshot right before we jumped in here. This was from the National Debt Clock, another good website to go doom scroll. We're we're knocking on the door of $36 trillion as a U.S. national debt, which works out to $106,000 debt per citizen and $272,000, almost $273,000 debt per taxpayer. Keep in mind that the average person in this country cannot afford a $500 emergency payment. The average person cannot afford a $500 emergency payment, let alone, their share of the $273,000 that they owe to pay off the debt. Not to mention that the entire structure of our current financial system, which is corrupt to the core, is meant to perpetuate this debt cycle because it is unsustainable unless the end goal, which, if you want to pop on the tinfoil hat, unless the end goal is to make it a totally, renter society, which then you can go and you can kind of, tip your hat towards the World Economic Forum video about, it's 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy kind of situation, right? I mean, that's what we're going towards. When you have a Federal Reserve who is the sole proprietor of all issuance of currency in the United States, the world reserve currency, so this has implications globally, they are the only ones who are able to print it, not even our own government. We don't even have control over our own currency. The Federal Reserve, which is a private banking institution with private shareholders, is the issuer of our legal tender. And they only issue it to our government, which we pay taxes to at interest. So tell me this, Adam, if you are the only person in the world who has honeybees and you were the only person who can make honey and you're willing to loan the world honey with the exception that, they give you that honey back plus a little extra, how does that ever work? How do you ever get that honey back, right? St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this a lot and when he gets into his arguments on usury, and he talks about the consumption of the thing, right? It's a totally immoral, inept, top to bottom system. And then you get into fractional reserve lending, which is a whole nother mountain that I don't even want to get into. But not only can you not pay the debt off, but it's not set up to pay the debt off. It's set up so that we increasingly create this divide that we have, where you have literally not even the top 1%, you have the top 0.1%, and everybody else who's getting poorer and poorer and poorer because we're paying into a system that is never going to see a return towards us, ever. And then this is how you end up with this, and it's growing and growing exponentially, which eventually probably leads to some kind of economic shock. This is something that I don't know if you listen to, or for anybody who's listening is a fan of Rudyard from What a Fault Hist. He puts out some interesting videos that make you think a little bit. He's obviously a very well-read guy. Obviously, I'm not, but he has kind of. He's made himself a little bit famous recently by saying, 1,000 deaths by April as a result of this election. I don't know if I'm there with him on that. I mean, that's quite a prediction to make. But what he does say is he believes that this financial crisis is going to be precipitated by a budget issue. And his idea is effectively that there's going to be some kind of budget issue that, there's a looming government shutdown. Probably on top of all this election nonsense, which who really knows what that's going to look like quite yet. And each side, because we're so entrenched and it's a winner takes all situation right now, no side is willing to compromise on this budget issue because both are submitting budget plans. But of course, anybody knows anything about politics, when you submit a budget plan, somewhere in there's a through line about subsidizing transgender surgery for illegal immigrant prisoners, and then that's the leftist through line. And then somewhere in there's a right-wing through line that says, no gender ideology in schools or something like that. And both sides are not willing to compromise, right? So there's your situation. There's your setup. There's the budget issue. Now the government shuts down. Now you have basic functions stop working. And maybe this is what precipitates a large financial crisis. And then everything starts dominoing from there. But we are more than primed for something like that. So there's the national debt. Here is growth and productivity and hourly compensation since 1948. So you can see they were kind of tracking pretty well. By the way, the whole impetus behind WTF happened in 1971. For those who don't know, is 1971 is when the United States was taken off the gold standard. And Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971. We were kind of untethered at that point, but all global currencies were still tethered to the US dollar, which allowed this kind of free printing that we have, and is the system that continues today, and we're seeing the results of it. So productivity has increased by 246%. Compensation has only increased by 115%, right? We already looked at the dual income versus single income households, how that's increased. Consumer price index, which just measures a basket of consumer goods across time. Look at that line skyrocketing since 1971. And by the way, this was also going up since really World War II because of some other things that we won't get into. But home value change. I mean, this is probably one of the biggest topics among young people, just not being able to afford a home. It's even getting difficult to rent. And people are not being inspired to try to go buy homes anymore. They're kind of checking out altogether. And I think a big thing and a big issue with this is Airbnb and Verbo homes, which is going to be, I think, crucial. And it's going to be talked about a lot when we do face this next economic collapse. But that's a little bit of a subtopic. Here's another thing: medium house home prices in New York and Boston then versus now. And then obviously looking at their income there as well. Big gaps. Here's a fun one in case you're wondering where all your money's been going. Here's payments to funding the state of Israel. I wish I had a chart up here for Ukraine as well, but they don't have that one on their website. Children per women. This is globally. This is not even the United States. And I think this is a good point to talk about kind of our objections to his idea of China taking over. And I know you and I were just talking about it. You mentioned it before we went live here, and I was like, I'm so glad you agree with me on this, because the whole world, and this is something that Elon Musk brings up, which I'm happy he does, at least he's brought it into the limelight, is the whole world is facing a demographic crisis on a large scale, on a scale that we've actually never seen before, in that our birth rates are collapsing, utterly collapsing. There is some silver lining in this, and that the birth rates that are not collapsing are usually in these very traditional religious communities. But beyond that, globally, our birth rates are collapsing, where we're literally not sustaining our population. And within our lifetimes, we're going to see a complete fall off the cliff with global population. And the ramifications of that can't even probably begin to be imagined. I know Korea, it's like one of the worst in the world right now. And I think that they said for every 100 adults that's alive in Korea today, out of every 100 adults, they will have 3 grandchildren. Which is, and I'm going to turn it over to you here real quick, and I'm going to try to look at that and verify that statistic, because it blew my mind. And this is where we are. And this is why I think that his analysis of China kind of being the new global power is a little short-sighted. And I think it's just because China is facing a huge demographic crisis, just like the rest of the world, if not worse, because of their one-child policy that they had for so many years. They are going to see the worst of it. Also, most of their infrastructure is really kind of cheaply and quickly built. But let me pull up that Korea thing.
And this is happening with all of the major East Asian countries, right? China, Japan, South Korea are all sort of leading the way in this upside down inverted population pyramid, where birth rates have collapsed, and they simply are not going to have enough young people to pay for the old people, whether that's, just simply their medical care, but the debt load that these countries have, you don't have a future, right? If there's not growth, and if the young people can't even support themselves, let alone support 3 to 4 retirees for each working adult in these countries, and that's quickly where they're headed. And I'm sure a lot of the people who are listening are at least somewhat familiar with Peter Zeihan, but he's one of the China experts, and he's been going out for years saying China's on the verge of collapse. I don't know about his timelines or anything, but he's very correct on simply the math doesn't work, where China is not going to have enough young people to replace the aging population. All of these major East Asian countries are aging, and of course, Ray Dalio sees China as the up and coming power, but these demographic problems are going to come home to roost a lot sooner than anybody thinks they are. And of course, a lot of these financial guys, they have this fallacy where, okay, well, they'll just open themselves up to immigration, as if an immigrant is an immigrant from Saudi Arabia is plug and play for a Chinese worker, right? It doesn't work that way. You can't just import the world and expect these, it to continue to function the same. The United States is one of the first countries to sort of experiment, at least in the modern age, with mass migration when they did it between let's say 1880 and 1920, and it caused all sorts of problems. There was tension at work between the immigrants who were coming in undercutting wages. You had immigrants bringing in all sorts of foreign political philosophies. They brought with them Marxism, they brought communism, they brought anarchism, caused all sorts of tension. And we came very close to a civil war back sort of around the time of World War I. And until we shut down immigration basically in the 1920s, immigration from anywhere except for Western and Northern Europe, basically we stopped the tap on that. We had to, because there were so many tensions happening and continuing to happen that would have been massively exacerbated by another wave of immigrants that likely would have come over at the end of World War I or shortly thereafter, as the Soviet Union collapsed basically in the 1920s with the famines that they had there. So we shut down immigration. We had several decades of these people to come and sort of assimilate and at least having a generation born after that was born as an American. But we're not having that now. And these Asian countries are not going to be able to handle that many new people coming in a society that is completely homogenous, right? And the United States was not. We had the advantage of being a functioning country without a entire homogeneity. These other countries are not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to take a plug and play worker, and it's going to be an issue. So Peter Zeihan, I think he kind of gets this correct, where there's not going to be another superpower to take over from the United States. The United States is going to diminish, but it's still going to be the best place to be. It's going to really suck to be everywhere else. And I sort of see that as a more realistic prediction than China knocking the US off its pedestal and becoming the world superpower.
Not to mention that a lot of these Asian countries just don't believe in immigration like the West does. They don't have this infectious idea over there that they must import anybody and everybody. I lived in Japan for a year, and they are probably one of the strictest countries when it comes to immigration. They are very, very strict, not just with immigration, but with even visas and stuff like that. And they are having obviously a big demographic crisis too. Peter Zeihan actually makes the argument that the entire reason why Putin ever went into Ukraine in the first place when he did was because Putin was seeing the same writing in the sand when it comes to the demographic crisis. And he felt like this decade was effectively the last chance where he would have the manpower to be able to secure kind of a defensive border that, he wants to do. And again, from his view is Russia wants to go in and kind of secure the old, whatever it is, the 6 points that is defendable, because Russia is one of those countries that's easily invaded. So he was making the argument that, demographics is leading them to have to do that now, because otherwise they won't have the manpower to do it in the future. And so, yeah, I think the demographic crisis is huge. It's going to be bigger in these Asian countries. And I think that, when you mention immigration here, yes, we did almost have a civil war during that time in the mid 1910s to 1920. And now you have the same problem, except, at least Europe has a tradition of kind of being in each other's spheres, right? There is some kind of neighborly acknowledgement of, between Germany and Italy and France and Britain. Not to say that any of these places really like each other, but they understood each other a little bit more, right? Now we're faced with a situation where we have people coming from all over the world. We have people immigrating from China, from Zimbabwe, from South America, from wherever, and they're all coming and they're waving their own flag, right? And what they're doing, and this is just natural, is immigrants tend to kind of form communities when they come into these countries, because it's easier for them, right? It's easier to get along. This is just natural human behavior. It's easier to get along amongst company of your own people, right? Your own language. It's easier. And so now you have all of these different groups reflecting different values that they're bringing with them, because again, we spent the last couple decades destroying the idea of American identity, making this effectively an economic zone for anybody and everybody to come. America is an idea, right? It's not a real nation. So now you have all these conflicting groups that are all tugging on the fabric of the same flag. Because the bureaucracy has grown into the behemoth that it has, we've lost this idea of subsidiarity, where we have effective power and control at the local levels like we ought to. So now everything is kind of taken up the ladder to the federal bureaucracy to be making the decision. So now we're all wrestling over, well, who's going to be president, or who's going to be in these important seats of power and these important institutions in the federal apparatus, because these are the big decision makers. And you have all these different interests who are competing with each other, tugging on the fabric of the same flag. And ultimately what happens, that flag gets ripped apart and everybody goes in different directions with it. And that's not a comfortable situation. And I think that's what we're facing. And I think that I agree with, Rudyard from Would Have Thought Hist. I agree with Ray Dalio here. I agree with a lot of people who understand that it is the financials that ultimately dictate what happens. I think the institutions have already been undermined enough on both sides. The political divide is already there enough. The only thing that's missing is something to precipitate that. And I think that's where we are.
One of the interesting things I noticed with the book was that even as it's clear that a nation is losing its status as the primary hegemon, it still kept its status as holding the world's reserve currency for several decades after. So even during the 1750s, when it was pretty clear that the English were going to be the next major world power, overtaking the Dutch, the Dutch still were held the reserve currency for several decades, basically until the start of the 19th century under Napoleon. And even as the English were passing that torch to the United States, the pound was still the reserve currency until really the 1950s. The dollar didn't take over until around that time. So that's the last part to go. So the dollar is still going to and I only have sort of a layman's understanding of this, but from what I understand, the Chinese yuan makes a really bad reserve currency because it's so devalued on purpose to make Chinese exports cheap. It makes a bad reserve currency because of that. So unless the BRICS nations or another economic bloc gets together and creates a new reserve currency to compete with the dollar, that's still going to hold power unless something better comes along. But it just doesn't seem possible that we're not going to see a total collapse. I mean, even if Trump wins, I don't see a course reversal on this. I don't see how a nation can possibly work its way out of the kind of debt that we now have.
Well, and I don't want to, I'm trying to avoid getting into the weeds on this too much because I really love the economic stuff. It fascinates me. And to the point of what you just said there, the BRICS nations actually added, I think, 6 new nations this year, which brought their total GDP, combined GDP, higher than the G7 nations. So the BRICS nations are nothing to scoff at. But yes, to your point about the Chinese currency, even the old Chinese government right now is encouraging their citizens to buy gold or to divest into gold because they kind of see what's coming, which I think Ray Dalio misses, which is that we are looking at a global collapse. Population crisis, global financial crisis. We're all tied to the same boat right now. And you have periods of like this in the history, which the most famous ones you can think of are like the Bronze Age collapse, which, you kind of had the end of the Egyptian dynasties and the Phoenicians and the Mesopotamians and all this. And then, and the Greeks. And then, out of this later, 1,000 years later, or whatever it was, grew the Roman civilization, right? And then Rome was kind of the predominant power for several centuries. And then Rome fell. And let me tell you, when Rome fell, there was a point at which Rome was the city of Rome, not Rome as a nation, but the city of Rome itself had estimated over 1 million people populating the city. Now, at least in Western tradition, or in Western countries, I should say, there wasn't another city that reached that population level until London in like the mid 1800s. Now, there's ideas that there were Chinese cities, but I mean, these were two very different worlds at this time, right? So all this just to say there are these points in history where you just have total contraction across the board. And so like you're talking, like Peter Zeihan talks about, where he says, the United States will probably maintain its dominance, but, just what's the phrase? A rising or a sinking tide sinks all ships or something like that. You know what I'm trying to say? The tide's going out globally and all ships are kind of going out with it right now. And so the United States might maintain a hegemon, but it's not going to look like the United States that it has looked like over the past couple of decades. And I think that's worth noting. And that's really what's most people are not prepared for. And, when you have a population collapse, you also kind of have a collapse in the structure of society, most notably, people who were doing this kind of blue collar work to keep the lights on. we already have examples of this in American history where you had deindustrialization in the United States, and now you have cities in the Northeast that, you know, Detroit, like there are parts of Detroit that are completely abandoned, which, you know, for me living in the South is like culture shock because you don't see that, right? And you can see this across the board. If you just don't have people to man these stations, you can have large populated areas today be completely abandoned in several decades. So the South Korea thing that I was looking at a minute ago, I couldn't find the exact statistic, but South Korea's current reproduction rate is 0.78, or in the way that is calculated, basically it's 78 babies for every 100 women. So the necessary sustainment, or the necessary total fertility rate for population replacement is 2.1 children per woman. So right now, Korea is looking at 0.78 children per woman. So they are in utter unrecoverable collapse.
I believe that is the worst in the world right now. I mean, obviously we
Yes.
don't have good data from the starving North Korea, but I would venture a bet that even North Korea is better than that.
Yeah, it's scary. And then and the only reason why these statistics don't look as drastic for, say, countries like France is because of the immigration. But I'm willing to bet that if you could get statistics not including the reproductive rates of immigrants coming into the country, it would look very similar. Even maybe in the United States, though I think we would fare a little bit better than some of these more progressive European countries. So
I believe in the last year, just the country of Ethiopia had more births than all of Europe combined.
Right. Yeah.
So these people are, I mean, Nigeria is in a similar situation, right? So you have these countries that have histories of famines that simply cannot support a large number of people because of the climate of these countries, are the ones that are having above replacement birth rates. So the only things that are going to happen is A, these people have to leave and go somewhere else, or B, they're going to starve, and we are going to see famines that kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people within the coming years.
What happens when these other big, you know, first world countries start to turn inwards to fix their own crises? And now you have these other countries, like you're talking about with Nigeria and Ethiopia, which are largely being artificially supported by outside efforts from these other first world countries. When that dries up, I mean, that could be disastrous to be there, you know.
I mean,
China,
we bailed out Ethiopia in the 70s, and even still the famine that they had there was catastrophic, and they've never recovered really until just now. But I mean, that famine that they had was enough to collapse a 1,500-year-old monarchy, one of the longest that has ever been in recorded history. That forced Haile Selassie to abdicate and completely change it. Then the country went communist. So I don't think, I mean, there may not be anybody to save should that happen again. I don't know if there's going to be anybody to bail them or another country in a similar situation out this time.
I think the recovery that they're experiencing right now is largely due to inputs from China, because China has been a big colonizing force in Africa right now. A lot of their infrastructure, a lot of the stuff that's coming up is due to not just Chinese exports, but Chinese labor largely. I mean, because the Chinese people were literally looking for places to send people to do work. So they've done a lot of these colonizing campaigns, which obviously nobody talks about. But yeah, I want to put a cap on the financial conversation. I do think we should come back maybe post-election and do a conversation more specifically focusing on the financials, because I could talk about it for hours. But the last thing I want to hit on as we close this conversation out about the coming election and afterwards is his point, Ray Dalio's point in this article on populism and extremism. So I just want to read this bit real quick. Out of disorder and discontent comes leaders who have strong personalities, are anti-elitist, and claim to fight for the common man. They are called populists. Populism is a political and social phenomenon that appeals to the ordinary people who feel that their concerns are not being addressed by the elites. Even somebody who doesn't pay attention to politics can identify this right now. Trump is very much a populist leader. And this is illustrated by, I think, the endorsements he's getting from people across the board. This is being illustrated by the fact that I don't think anybody's been excited about any political candidate in so much in my lifetime. I would say probably in the lifetime of my parents and grandparents as well. I mean, this guy is a once in a generation, if not more, political figure. And it's remarkable in one sense to be a part of that, but it's also worth understanding that populism from my perspective, is almost always kind of a bellwether for what's to come, in that populism is a response to something that's failing, and it's a stop along the way towards a solution structure. And a populist like Trump is somebody who usually comes in and is the first guy to say, everybody's kind of quietly acknowledging things are broken. And then you have Trump come in and say, things are broken. And everybody says, yes, things are broken. And you have somebody like Trump get elected to office. And then you have the fallen effects. And obviously everybody's going after Trump. But I think Trump represents an archetype of a populist figure who precedes a more strongman figure, which I think Ray Dalio is referring to here. Now, I don't know if Ray Dalio sees, I assume Ray Dalio sees Trump as the populist figure, but I know there's certainly plenty of people out there on the left who would see Trump as a strongman figure. I'm going to say that we have not seen our strongman figure yet. And I used to believe that we were, in this point in time where we were seeing the collapse of America as we know it. And sure, there's parts of that, but I think now, as I've studied history a little bit more, I think we're in this phase where you see this populist uprising that precedes the strongman figure to come in and fundamentally transform society. So things that I'm thinking about are Caesar, right? Caesar is the strongman, but before Caesar, you had the Crassus and the Gracchi brothers, right? These were populist figures. You had the triumvirate. These were populist figures who were kind of revolting against the corrupt Senate at the time. You had severe economic crisis in the Roman Empire at the time, particularly for Roman citizens. And so there was all this, all these problems. These populist figures became very unpopular because they were revolting against the Senate. And then finally, you had this Caesar figure come in and transform the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire, as we all remember it very well. You had the same thing during the French Revolution, right? You had the tearing down of the old monarchy, which I am no fan of the French Revolution, but there were obviously issues because there has to be something to kind of sink your teeth into a little bit to start a movement like that, right? You had the tearing down of the old monarchy system. It led to total anarchy and populism, and then you had Napoleon, the strongman figure, emerge out of that. And there are these themes that repeat throughout history, and I think this is where we are now. I think there's obviously a broken system in America. Everybody identifies the broken system. Trump has become the populist leader, and now we're kind of waiting to see, we're obviously looking ahead to this election, but I'm also looking ahead to see, okay, what comes after Trump, right? It's hard for me to imagine, though I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is hard for me to imagine that, let's say Trump gets elected, he does his 4 years, and then we just go back to what? Mitt Romney era politics, because of the figure and the path that Trump has opened up. It seems hard that anybody's going to want to go back, especially given that we understand that the financial situation that we're in right now is not going to be fixed by any one president. It's not going to be fixed by any institution at all. It has to break in order to be fixed again.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't see Trump as the strong man. I never have, and I always thought it was goofy for people to try and shoehorn him into this. I mean, I remember back in the 2016 election, everybody thought he was their guy, from the hardcore evangelicals to the neo-Nazis, right? Everybody thought Trump was going to be their guy. And it was ridiculous because he never really said anything of substance, and never really had an ideology other than, some basic populist stuff where we got to look at our immigration system. And, you guys in the Rust Belt, you guys in the Coal Belt, you have been shafted and have been given the short end of the stick for far too long. Other than that, everybody just kind of, I guess, put their own ideology on top of Trump, which was not, much of anything. But I don't think he has it in him to be the strong man. I personally hope we don't see the strong man. I mean, I am sort of a Jeffersonian, idealist, but I don't think that Jeffersonian democracy is going to be able to fix the financial problems that we have unless we make the the decision to balkanize and sort of go towards a path of disunion, which I also don't see as being a very good thing, because I feel like that'll just devolve into potentially the worst outcome that we could see. But either way, I don't think Jeffersonian ideals are going to save us at this point. I think we are far too far along down the road towards complete fiscal insanity from where we are. And it's going, if we are going to get out of it, it's going to take a strong man. I don't want to see that. I don't want to admit that, but I don't see another path forward. And I certainly don't think it's going to be Donald Trump to fill that. Even if he wins, he's not going to fix this. It's going to take a complete systemic overhaul that I don't think the system we have is capable of doing. I don't think, as great statesmen as they were, I don't think that the system the founding fathers put together foresaw sort of where we were going to be devolving into, from a high trust nation, or really what they saw, a collection of states, into having the system where the president was going to be this winner take all election. The system that they wanted, it shouldn't have mattered to the basic American citizen who the president was. It shouldn't have been something we had to think about on a daily basis. But here we are, right? We've already broken the system that they set forth for us, and we've got to fix this one way or the other, or it's going to be very, very bad for everyone.
To your point, I actually had something highlighted in this article from Ray Dalio. There's already been conversation openly about national divorce. So the idea is not just floating around there, it's out there. And he says, it's a mistake to rigidly believe that any economic or political system is always best, because there will certainly be times when that system is not best for the circumstances at hand. And if a society doesn't adapt, it will die. And I think that, not to say that we're just totally victims of the life cycles of history here, but I think it's important to work into and play into the cycles that naturally occur and understand that, and I think even the right has gotten away from this too, is just this like dogmatic belief in like the total, what's the word? The total belief, trust, and faith in the Constitution as being a document that is unflawed, right? Which is not true. And I don't mean to rag on it. I'm sure that the founders had good intentions and they were doing the best that they could. But I think that it's important to understand that, we have to understand that there are going to be changes over time, and that we can't be married to this one system, especially if the system is broken. I mean, as much as many of us love the Constitution and some of the ideals that were established in there, it's also led to the situation that we're in now. And so I think it's important to realize that and understand that, and kind of, you can still love these things while also recognizing that change is inevitable and change has to happen. And so I think to be a part of that change and not allow it to devolve into total anarchy, French Revolution style, but to be somebody who's proposing positive change in the right direction is going to be incredibly important. And if we can do that with staying within the framework of our founders, then great. But I don't know if that's necessarily something that will happen.
I mean, it was George Washington of all people who said, look, if you devolve into factionalism, this will fail. And here we are. I mean, we are as factional as it can be. The divide in this country is far worse than it was even on the eve of the Civil War, right? I mean, in 1859, Americans largely lived very similar lives, North and South. They went to church and sang similar hymns. They read the same newspapers, but and they spoke the same language. So many of these things about, no matter where you were, it was you were still an American. But we were divided on this one single issue of slavery that ended up tearing the nation apart. Now you see those factions have completely different worldviews. I mean, it's almost like talking to someone from a totally different country. And if we were able to be torn in half by a single issue in the past, I don't know how you reconcile, having a situation like we're in right now, without going, back to the best case scenario, in my opinion, is to look at a Jeffersonian model where basically the states get to do what they want, and you massively get rid of the federal government to the point where, like I said, the president shouldn't matter who it is. California can go be California, Michigan can be Michigan, and the average American has the ability to choose, what side of the debate they're going to take by voting with their feet. Was sort of the idea that the founders had given to us. But the fact that we have a federalized state at this point, I don't see a way we get out of this without, like I said, changing the system, hopefully peacefully, but it's looking darker and darker every day.
And I think that's why the idea of a peaceful national divorce was ever brought up. I mean, not that it's being widely entertained, and that should be a telltale sign of maybe which direction we're headed in, but the people who are proposing that are saying, we are reaching irreconcilable differences. and to the point of no return. And so the best way to get out of this peacefully is to create this kind of national divorce where people can peacefully separate and kind of go their own way. But there's just, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not, but either way, there's just too many interests at play to ever let that happen, I think. And it's never going to be genuinely entertained. So
yeah, it's a pipe dream, and I fear that getting out of it any other way is going to be perhaps unthinkable at this point, what the negative consequences of that might be.
Yeah, Ray Dalio says, when the causes that people are passionately behind are more important to them than the system for making decisions, the system is in jeopardy. Rules and laws work only when they are crystal clear, and most people value working within them enough that they are willing to compromise in order to make them work well. So he's basically just saying there, again, we have this idea or this allegiance to the Constitution, but it's really not the Constitution that we're allied to. It's the principles found within the Constitution. It's the ideas that gave birth to the Constitution, and this is what people's allegiances are to or against, right? Most people's allegiances are to something, not necessarily against something, and so democracy kind of necessarily requires consensus enough to the point that people can compromise on things to work out. And the idea is, even within a democracy, that everybody's working towards a common goal, right? You can have two different parties. You can have 12 different parties who maybe have different ideas about how to get towards this common goal. But when the common goal becomes different, well, now we're going in different directions. So what's the point of compromising if we don't even have the same end state in mind? And I think that's where we are today. And I think that's why the system is fundamentally failing. So to wrap all of this up, I just want to stress that, let me see if I can go back to the slide. I had a slide here in the very beginning. A quote by Vladimir Lenin where he says, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. And I think it's a strong case of normalcy bias to assume that it can't happen here. Again, I'm not making any predictions. I know you're not making any predictions, but like Ray Dalio says here, civil wars inevitably happen. So rather than assuming it won't happen here, which most people in most countries assume after an extended period of not having them, it is better to be wary of them and look for the markers to indicate how close one is. Ray Dalio wrote all of this from the perspective of a financial advisor, I suppose, but I think he also, in writing this, realized the real world implications beyond finances that it's going to affect. And I think that's what we need to understand too. And I think there are so many more implications beyond the finances and the political scene that we need to be considering going forward and how we're kind of going to rebuild coming out of this. So do you have any closing thoughts? I do want to do a little fun prediction as far as the election goes. We're recording this on Friday night, November the 1st. So we are 5 days away from the election here. We'll probably get this uploaded this weekend. So any closing thoughts on the book and the article?
My closing thoughts are, I'm thankful that it's by the grace of God we're not in a worse position than we actually are right now. Like I said, I really thought that we were going to be hitting that economic shock back in 2022. I hedged my own financial bets that way, and I did lose, but thankfully for everyone, we're still hanging on. But at the same time, I also thought we'd be seeing a lot more violence than we have. Obviously, we've now seen two attempts on the life of former President Trump, but I'm actually surprised and very thankful that we haven't seen worse political violence yet in this election cycle. I truly hope that we see such a blowout, one way or the other, honestly, that it becomes extremely obvious on election night who actually won, and that there's no questions of shenanigans. And I believe, should that happen, the chance of this turning violent are going to be much, much lower.
Mm-hmm.
I just hope we can put this to bed quickly and we get through the next few weeks without what could be world-changing events through political violence happening in this country. We've been insanely lucky so far that this hasn't happened, and
Right.
I just pray that that trend continues. It is by the grace of God we are still in the situation we're in, but this could change at any time, and we're very fortunate and very blessed. For as dark as things look, they could be so much worse right now.
And by the way, I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but Ray Dalio did write up a follow-up article, a brief one to this one, where he basically kind of took half a step back, and this was right after the Trump assassination, where he believed that because of the Trump assassination, he was going to be so popular now that a blowout was basically not going to precipitate this immediate fallout effect of a civil war type scenario. Now, from my perspective, even with the assassination attempts, it's still looking like the election is going to be kind of close. And I think that is the worst case scenario in a really close election, because obviously both sides are going to want to contest in that situation. But I think we're looking at a close election. It could come down to the wire. It could go either way. I want Trump to win, but I'll tell you what I think is going to happen. I think ultimately Trump is going to win. I think there's going to be a lot of contention, but I think the reason why we haven't seen the violence to the degree that we saw back in like the Summer of Love and all these types of things is largely because both sides are kind of playing each other's role right now. And what I mean by that is the right is necessarily conservative, authoritarian, institutional, and the left is necessarily progressive, revolutionary. And so we've kind of been both on the back foot in the situations that we've been in for the last 4 years, which is that the left has kind of had institutional power with Joe Biden as president, and the right has kind of been the revolutionary with, you know, Trump as the leader pushing back against the institutional left. And now the left likes to feel like the eternal revolutionary, and the right likes to feel like they're conserving something. So I think the more likely situation for a kinetic event in this country, obviously understanding the economic situation having to precipitate first, is that the right retains control in this election, and the left is now again back into this revolutionary, we have to fight the man. I do follow kind of a lot of open intelligence stuff, and we have not seen a lot of the mobilization of these left-wing groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter like we did back then. So I think there is going to have to be a re-energizing phase of these groups that have kind of tapered off a little bit if we were to see something like that. But again, you know, there are weeks where decades happen. If there's something that suddenly precipitates that, we could see the whole country turn on its head again, just like we did with COVID and just like we did with the Summer of Love. So I hope and pray that Trump wins this election, that it's a peaceful election, and you know, whatever hard times are coming, that we're able to navigate through them together as a strong collective society. But I fear that whether it be after this election next year or in the next 5 years, we are headed for something radically transformational in this country, and we should all not just take note of that, but actively prepare for that. And that's kind of my final prediction and conclusion.
Yeah, I also believe that Trump is probably going to win here. I think all the momentum has been in his favor for the last month. And I mean, I think, at least from what I see locally, people are really, really hurting under the current economic conditions. I mean, I have a monthly grocery bill that, I'll be honest with you, I can't afford. I cannot afford to spend $1,200 a month on food, right? And still, you know, meet my expenses and continue to save for the future in other ways. But I'm not the only one who's in this situation, right? There's a lot of people who you know, make even less money and have even more obligations, and they're in an even worse boat. So I think people are hurting right now. At least in my area, all the ads are either related to abortion, or Trump is going to impose a national sales tax. And, you know, other than abortion, I just don't think that those other attacks on Trump are landing right now. I only hope people choose to vote with their wallet rather than put abortion as the single issue that is going to destroy Western civilization as we know it. And, you know, if an issue does destroy Western civilization, I think Satan would love it to be abortion, which we could very well see. But either way, I do think that Trump is going to pull a win here. But even if he does, I think we should all make it clear, Trump is not going to save us. We are going to face very, very difficult times regardless of who wins. Trump could put the people in places where they need to be to help put things back together in a way that people who believe the things that we do would like to see, and in the way that would allow this country to continue on a path to success. If Kamala is there, you know, the people she puts in the places to put the pieces back together, we will own nothing and be happy, right? We will be following that World Economic Forum agenda, and that's just the way it's going to be. And it's going to be a much, much harder situation to climb out of in the end. So
Mhm.
we're not going to be saved either way. We will be facing hard times, but it's playing the long game here, I think. And I hope that most common sense people see Trump as the person to be able to do that.
Yeah, and with that, guys, I mean, we are days away from the election. I don't exactly know when this video is going to be uploaded, but I know it'll be before the election. So please, please, please do your part. Go out and vote. I used to be pretty nihilistic, and I was totally anti-political solution. I didn't believe voting that mattered, but I have come around on that, and I believe that voting is important, even if you don't necessarily believe in the legitimate outcome. I think, you know, it's the whole idea of giving money to a homeless person. You know, they might use it to go buy food, they might use it to go buy drugs, but the act of charity that you're performing in goodwill is important as much as what they're doing with the money. So please do go out and vote. Go out and vote, vote, vote. Vote for Trump, by the way. If you're voting for Kamala, then don't go vote. But anyway, yeah, so we will do perhaps we'll do a post-election discussion, whether that be next week or next month or next year. Who knows what's going to happen? But we will take a look and see when the time comes. So thank you guys for tuning in. I talked to Adam before this, and I said, we should keep this 30 minutes, and I haven't been keeping track, but I know it wasn't 30 minutes. So if you guys stuck with us through the whole thing, thank you. I appreciate it. If you guys have any thoughts or comments on what's going to happen, anything that we discussed tonight, anything you'd like us to discuss in the future, please do put it down in the comments below. Again, I will link the article and the book in the description below if you guys would like to go check that out. Please follow us on social media if you have not yet already. We're on Twitter. We got banned from Instagram and Facebook, so don't go looking for us there, but you can also find us on Telegram, Gab. I think we're on Minds. We're obviously here on YouTube. All of that will be linked below for you guys. And follow us on our website. If you guys want to go to our website, you can sign up for our email list and check out our newsletter, which gets sent out monthly. We will be sending out a brand new, fresh newsletter coming out in 2025, so look forward to that. If you guys are interested in becoming a part of what we do here, getting involved with the organization, please reach out to us, send us an email. We'd love to get in touch with you and see what we can do and how we can work with you. So thank you again, Adam, for being here for this long conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you all for watching. Good night. God bless. Go vote, and we will see you after the election.